Stand in any schoolyard full of kids at recess and no doubt you'll hear that inevitable refrain of childhood. That's not fair. How early do we learn about fairness and how does culture shape our ideas about it? Maria Konnikova writes about psychology and science for the New Yorker magazine and has given these questions some thought. And she joins us now from New York, New York. Maria, it's good to have you on TVO. I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from one of your pieces and then we'll go from there. How we learn fairness. A pair of brown capuchin monkeys are sitting in a cage. From time to time, their caretakers give them tokens, which they can then exchange for food. It's a truth universally acknowledged that capuchin monkeys prefer grapes to cucumbers. So what happens when unfairness strikes? When, in exchange for identical tokens, one monkey gets a cucumber and the other a grape? A monkey in isolation is happy to eat either a grape or a slice of cucumber. But a monkey who sees that she's received a cucumber while her partner has gotten a grape reacts with anger. She might hurl her cucumber from her cage. Okay, Maria, what are these monkeys teaching us about the notion of fairness?
That cucumbers are worse than grapes.
Indeed, indeed.
So what this research shows, and this is kind of a classic in the study of fairness, is that there's something very innate to disliking getting less, or something that's known in psychological terms as disadvantageous inequity aversion. We are averse to unfairness when it disadvantages us. And so these monkeys are saying, hey, that's not fair. They're saying the exact same thing the kids on the playground say when they think that something isn't fair. So that shows us that there's something very innate about that. We do not like getting the short end of the stick.
So it happens with us, it happens with monkeys. Are there any other species for whom this disadvantageous inequity is an issue?
Absolutely. In multiple species that have been studied, including other primate species, dogs, people have found that this actually does exist. So it seems to permeate the animal kingdom, at least as far as we've looked.
All right, if there's something called disadvantageous inequity, I presume the opposite is also a thing, advantageous inequity. What's that?
Absolutely. So that's the exact same thing, thinking that something is unfair and so rejecting it, being averse to it, except this time when the split favors you. So if we think about the monkeys, it would be akin to a monkey getting a grape, seeing that the other monkey got a cucumber, getting mad at that and throwing away the grape even though it's the tastier treat. Now in monkeys that doesn't happen, but in humans, people have found that at some point in life, some people in some societies start exhibiting that sort of behavior. So when they get more, they reject it just like they would if they got less. And the only thing they won't reject is when there's an even split, when something seems equitable.
What methods are used to test human responses to advantageous inequity?
So the classic, one of the things that's used quite often is you divide a resource like candy if you're dealing with children because children like candy, money if you're dealing with adults because adults like money. It's like the candy equivalent for adults. And so you do different splits. So for instance, I can give you $1 and I'll give your partner $3 and I'll ask, is that okay? And you can either accept it or reject it. And so in that case, obviously disadvantageous, you say, no, I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to reject it. Now let's flip it. I'm going to give you 3 and I'm going to give your partner 1. Are you going to accept or reject it? What we find is actually it depends. In some situations, you will reject it. And so there is something that seems to develop that says, hey, I don't want to get less, but I also don't really like it if I get a lot more than you.
So we have this innate understanding that naturally we don't want to be disadvantaged, but we're not sure we want our neighbors or our friends to be disadvantaged as well. Is that consistent with adults and children, that reaction?
So it ends up, and this is work that's being done right now, it ends up that it develops much later. So aversion to getting less, not wanting to be disadvantaged, that happens at a very, very young age. So small children will already start rejecting unfair offers of candy, say. The smallest will take it because candy's candy, but very, very early on, they will realize, you know what, I'm going to reject this even if I even if I won't get any candy at all. And they're not being nice, because it's actually quite a mean thing to do, because you're preventing the other kid from getting candy as well. So it's really something that can be quite spiteful, and that prevents the greater good just because you don't want to get less. But that advantageous aversion doesn't seem to develop until much later in life, sometimes as late as 8, 9, 10, sometimes even later. And as it turns out, in some cultures, it never develops at all.
Well, I would think sibling rivalry prevents it from developing at too young an age, right? I mean, you do need to get more than your sibling. That's just a fact.
Absolutely.
Have you got siblings?
Absolutely. I do. I have a number of them. In fact, I'm the youngest of 4.
And do you recall this from your own childhood being a thing?
I definitely recall saying that's not fair. And now I'm from Moscow. I was born in Moscow, and so that was the Soviet Union, and that's a very different place culturally. The concept of fairness is not nearly as ingrained in that society as it is here. And so in school I would hear that's not fair, and so I said that's not fair. And I remember my mom looking at me and saying, you know what, fair or not fair has nothing to do with it. That's not a phrase that you shouldn't think that way. You need to think about, what's happening, start questioning it. But I definitely remember thinking that's not fair, because I remember her reprimanding me.
I got news for you, Maria. That line of parents, that's life and life's not fair, is universal. Doesn't matter whether it was the Soviet Union or North America or whatever. Here's a question you pose in your article, and I want to read it to you now and then get you to amplify on it if you would. If disadvantageous inequity is really about status rather than fairness, could advantageous inequity be about status too? You asked the question. What's the answer?
Well, I think the answer is we still don't know. This is ongoing research, and we don't have enough evidence to answer this definitively. But there is some evidence that it might have something to do with status too. So here are a few things we do know. We know, for instance, that that in a lot of societies, as inequity gets larger, if you are a part of the group that has more, people really don't like you. And that's not a very stable social outcome, because if you're disliked, if you're distrusted, that's not just unpleasant, but it could be dangerous. And so it could actually help your status in several ways if you give up if you give up your disadvantageous advantage, which is actually advantageous to you. It's a mouthful. But if you give that up, that shows people several things. It says, look, I'm a nice person. I'm someone who actually will abide by social norms. I'm someone who's good, and it makes them like you more, which is also very good. That's social currency.
Let's look at some cultural influences here, and once again I want to quote from your piece. You say, in Canada, the United States, and Uganda, the study shows that older kids are more likely, on average, to reject an advantageous offer than an equal offer. By contrast, in Mexico, Peru, India, and Senegal, they willingly accept getting more. In the past, studies of AI have focused on so-called weird societies: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Any theories as to why that would be?
So the theory that is put forward by the authors of the paper, or one of the theories, I should be equitable to the authors, and they do say that this is just one theory, is that there's something about Western norms, that we teach norms of fairness in Western society in a way that's not taught, that's not universal to all societies. And so whereas disadvantageous inequity aversion is innate, advantageous inequity aversion has to be learned. I don't think that's disputed. The question is, how do we learn it? Where does it come from? And they say, well, it might be that Western societies have these sorts of norms of fairness. Of course, their data don't quite support that, because there's Uganda, and Uganda is not a Western society. And they have an explanation for that. They say, okay, well, but Uganda, there are lots of Western schools there. A lot of Western educators come and teach in Uganda, and so maybe that's why. But I think that that's a little bit of a leap of faith, because other societies, for instance, Mexico, are also exposed to Western culture, to Western modes of thinking. And so one would think that it would emerge there as well if that were the explanation. And so I think that there might be something else going on, but we don't quite know what it is. And maybe Western norms have something to do with it, but it doesn't seem like that's the whole story. And by the way, there's a huge part of the world that isn't represented here at all. I mean, we don't have anyone from China, Japan, any of those Asian countries. We don't know what that kind of thinking would do either.
But the best thinking on this suggests, though, that culture has something to do with it, yes?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
The thinking is that culture has something to do with it, that it's something about what culture teaches us. What we're not sure, what we still need to try to figure out is what is it exactly, and is it something that is, why is it only in some societies that it's being taught?
Well, we do see sort of attempts at democracy or fairness, if you like, from kindergarten on. You do go into any schoolyard and a teacher can ask 10 kids, okay, are we going to play tag or hide and seek? Hands up, and majority rules. I mean, that's a pretty good lesson from the get-go, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm not trying to dismiss Western norms. I do think that that Western norms definitely teach about fairness, about equal distribution, and so there's definitely something to that. But it seems like there's something else as well. Otherwise, it would be really difficult to explain, I think, the Uganda scenario.
At the end of the day, in all of this, we're looking for equality, I guess. That's sort of what the prize is here. From your findings, would you say equality is an impossible mission, an impossible task for any society to attain?
Oh, what a question. We end on such a philosophical note.
Oh, no, I got more. We're not ending yet.
All right, we are heading in such a philosophical direction. Is equality an impossible ideal? I think it depends on what you mean by equality. And I'm not trying to hedge my answer. What I mean by that is, are we talking about everyone deserves to have the same no matter what? Are we talking about equality based on effort, based on how much you work? There's actually very good research on that shows that, yes, kids like fair divisions, but if they perceive that someone has worked harder, so for instance, if you show cartoons to little kids and one of the cartoon figures clearly is working harder than the other, they're totally okay with an unequal split because they still think it's equitable. It's still fair, even though it's not equal, because one person worked harder, so one person deserved more. And so I think that because it's a sliding definition, it's a difficult question to answer. And I do think it will always be an ideal in the sense that I don't think we'll ever all agree on what the correct answer to that should be. And once you start saying it's how much you deserve based on your effort, well, who measures that? And who actually says what effort is worth and how much more you should get based on that extra effort? Those are all really difficult questions to wrestle with.
Indeed. All right, let's finish on this one here. Before we started this interview, I told you off air that our producer, Meredith Martin, was a big fan of yours, and she has 2 twin girls who are, I think, about 8 years old right now, and they are constantly, as one would expect, arguing about fairness. And as you might imagine, with twins, the issue of fairness takes on even more importance than it would, say, in your home, where you were one of 4 siblings, but of different ages, so there's a different dynamic happening there. Is there any way, in your view, having looked at this, to teach kids that fairness is not whatever advantages one over another?
Wouldn't every parent like an answer to that question? I don't think that we have a good way of teaching it rather than just teaching by example and by explaining situations. So actually talking through these scenarios and saying, hey, when you're rejecting this type of thing, why are you rejecting it? And what does it actually mean? And, in the end, so there's a really interesting example in this particular study that you and I were talking about with Mexico, where they actually don't develop even disadvantageous inequity aversion for a while. They do it much later than other children, and that's because they know each other, or so we think, because these are all kids for whom reputation doesn't matter as much because they've already established reputation in a different way. And so maybe when it comes to children, when it comes to twins, that's a more powerful thing to do, and to explain, if you don't reject this offer, then you can both share it, you can both split it. It's not a zero-sum game, because I think to a lot of kids it is a zero-sum game. They say, oh, if I don't have it, then you have it. But if you explain it as, what goes around comes around, and you guys will be interacting for years and years, then I think you'll start seeing children develop in a much nicer, less spiteful direction.
We do have to get our heads around the notion of fairness not necessarily meaning identical treatment, right? Those are different things.
Absolutely.
On this we agree. Okay. Maria, it's awfully good of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Maria Konnikova from New York City, where she is a writer for The New Yorker with a regular column on psychology and culture. Maria, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.